Surprise Island, Chapter 13 and 14. Chapter 13. Joe again. I wish Mike would come over every day, said Benny one morning. Well, I don't, said all the others at once. Henry looked up. I think we can get along without any company at all. You don't call Joe company, do you? Asked Violet. Oh, no, said Henry. He's just one of the family. Why? Did you want to invite him to eat with us? No, said Violet slowly. But today he said I would be ready to play to you after my lesson. Have him stay for supper, said Jessie. She looked at Henry. Benny, come here, said Henry. Do you know that today is your birthday? No, said Benny, walking over to his brother. Well, it is, Henry went on. And now what do you want for a present? We will buy it for you. Cream, said Benny. Do you mean ice cream? Asked Henry. No, I don't. I mean cream in a bottle like milk, a big bottle, not a little one. That's a queer kind of present, said Violet. You want to drink it? Asked Jessie. No, I want to put it on some blackberries, like Peter Rabbit. We'll get a big bottle of cream then, Jessie, said Henry, laughing. Benny began to jump around the barn and yell. Benny and Jessie, Violet is going to bake you a birthday cake before she takes her lesson. Is she? Asked Benny, giving a last yell. I want to watch her make my cake. Violet got out her cooking things. She laid everything that she needed out on a pie board. We will put the candles around the cake, said Violet. I want a candle in the middle, said Benny. Yes, but we have to save the middle. Violet stopped suddenly. Never mind, said Jessie. Benny doesn't know what we want to save the middle for. The cake looked wonderful, and when Violet took it out of the oven, Benny said, it smells just like a birthday cake. Before she put the frosting on, Violet put the cake on 2 plates to get cold. Let's sit down, said Jessie, and have a quick lunch of bread and milk. Then Henry can get the cream and candles, and Violet can take her lesson while I wash the dishes. I'll wipe the dishes for you, said Benny. Aren't you a good boy, cried Jessie, and on your birthday, too. You will have a happy birthday, I'm sure of it. They were all just finishing when Joe and Violet came in carrying their violins. Violet's ready to play for you, said Joe. Will everyone please sit down? Jessie was excited as she sat down on one of the boxes between Henry and Benny. Violet did not seem to be either excited nor afraid. It was the first time she had played for anyone besides Joe. She waited now, holding her violin, for her teacher to tell her where to stand. Joe told Violet to stand facing the door. He stood with his back to the wall where he could watch Violet. Then they began to play. Violet's part was very easy, but Joe's part was very hard. It seemed to be only Violet's playing that the children heard. Violet did not seem like their sister. Beautiful, cried Jessie at the end. She's good, isn't she? Asked Joe, turning around. Wonderful, said Henry. She could be a real violin player, couldn't she, Joe? She could be, and she will be, replied Joe. I wish Violet would play it again so I would get used to it, said Benny. Do play it again, said Jessie. I could listen all day. Violet and Joe began to play the piece again. When they were halfway through it, Mr. Browning appeared at the barn door. Violet looked up and smiled, but she did not stop playing. When the piece was finished, Mr. Browning cried, John. Joe turned around and said, Oh, Mr. Browning. He held out his hand. I'm really glad to see you. Everything is all right again. Well, I'm glad to see you, my boy, said Mr. Browning. I have been looking for you for a long time. Here are my friends, said Joe. This is Jessie. Oh, we did meet, said Mr. Browning, said Jessie with a smile. We know him quite well. Please, everybody sit down. I could never forget the girl who makes apple pies with a green bottle, said Mr. Browning, taking the company chair. Or this little girl who plays the violin so well. You see, children, this Joe of yours is my best friend. He's my best friend, said Benny. Yes, I think you told me so when I was here before, answered the man looking at Benny. But he was my best friend before he was yours. Benny thought this over. He could have 2 best friends, he said. Good for you. Will you let me ask him where he has been and what's the matter with him? Nothing's the matter with Joe, said Benny. That's right, said Joe. I wasn't well for a long time, and for a while I didn't even remember who I was. I'll tell you about it later. Now I'm better and ready to go back to the museum and to my uncle, and if he'll have me. Have you? Said Mr. Browning. Your uncle has almost worn himself out worrying about you. Then the sooner the better, said Joe. He works in the museum, thought Henry. He is a very clever man, thought Jessie. Did you think Joe was a handyman working for Captain Daniel? Asked Mr. Browning. No, said Henry. I thought he worked in a museum, but was taking some time off. I began wondering when he got us all those books, said Violet. He found the names of the shells and flowers right away. Joe, said Jessie, did you write all those books? I remember we said the name on the books is just like ours. Joe smiled, but he didn't say anything. I don't think you know yet who he is, cried Mr. Browning. I do, said Benny. He knows more than what is in all those books, and he works in a museum. That's right, said Mr. Browning. He is the head of a museum. Do you think his name is Joseph Alden? Yes, said Benny, I think that too. Well, it is. It is John Joseph Alden, said Mr. Browning. But you don't understand yet. He's your cousin. What? Cried the children together. Yes, said Mr. Browning. Joe's father was your grandfather, and your grandfather were brothers. Joe, did you ever live with grandfather? Asked Henry. Joe looked at his cousins and said, I used to live there before I went away, and now I think I'll go back. That is, if Uncle James will have me, and my cousins don't mind. Mind? Cried Henry. It would be wonderful. Oh, Joe, shouted Benny, you can keep on knowing things all the time. I'd rather have you live with us than ever watch, and nobody could say more than that. Chapter 14, Everyone's Birthday. Somebody had better call Grandfather right away, said Henry. Let me, said Benny, it's my birthday. Later, when Benny came back from Captain Daniel's hut, he said, Grandfather's coming today, and he's bringing Dr. Moore and his mother. That's great, said Henry. We'll have a big party. Then Benny said to Joe, Are you going to tell Grandfather that he's your grandfather too? He isn't my grandfather, Benny. He's my uncle. All right. Are you going to tell him that he's your uncle? Asked Benny. He will know me as soon as he sees me, replied Joe. Mr. Browning said, I don't think he had better see you suddenly, John. He must be very sad because he thinks that you were lost. Sudden news like that is not good for an old man. Let Jessie fix it, said Joe. I will stay in the hut until you tell me it's all right. Jessie promised to do her best. Joe went back to Captain Daniel's hut to wait. In a few minutes they could see the motorboat coming, and soon Mr. Alden and the Moores were on the dock. Hello, Grandfather, cried Benny. It's my birthday. Well, so it is, replied Mr. Alden. Happy birthday, my boy. Then everyone began to speak at once. That's a big basket you have, said Jessie to Dr. Moore. Shh, shh, said the doctor, laughing. He took out another big basket just like it and some packages. Presents, he whispered to Jessie. I got a big bottle of cream for my birthday, Grandfather, said Benny. It was funny, Grandfather, said Jessie, half laughing. That's all he wanted, so we got it. You did right, my dear, said Mr. Alden. People should have what they want on their birthdays. I got lots of surprises today, Benny went on. He doesn't know them all himself yet, said Jessie quickly. She didn't know that Benny might say next. What Benny might say next. This island is full of surprises, and that would be a good name for it, Surprise Island. It would, cried Henry. Just think of all the surprises we've had. Let's call it Surprise Island. I think that's a wonderful name, said Mrs. Moore. I hope they were all good surprises. Everyone, said Henry, trying to get Benny to think of something else. There were clams, and the Indian things, and the violin, and my birthday, said Benny. Are your veins all right, Grandfather? Veins? Asked Mr. Alden. Yes, said Benny. You know, some people have funny veins, so when they hear something awfully good, suddenly they just drop down dead. I'm sure that good news wouldn't kill me, said Mr. Alden. Now, Mrs. Moore, just look at the white sand. Isn't it beautiful? It certainly is, said Mrs. Moore. It's very good sand for houses, too, said Benny, running down to it. Let's build a house then, said Dr. Moore, putting down the baskets. Jessie was trying to think of exactly the right way to tell her grandfather about Joe. She had not wanted to tell the news too suddenly, but Benny seemed to have made it easy. I suppose Benny's right about the veins, isn't he, grandfather? She said. I suppose so, said Mr. Alden, laughing. He sat down on the rock. But I never could understand it. If I had good news, I wouldn't want to miss the fun. Well, that sounds right to me, said Henry, laughing. Jessie could not wait any longer. We have a wonderful surprise for you, grandfather, she said, getting up. Come. You know what you promised about the veins? You can't drop dead because you promised, shouted Benny. What do you mean? Asked Mr. Alden, looking very white. He started to go with the excited children. Think of the nicest surprise you can, said Henry. What would that thing be? It wouldn't be a thing. It would be a man, said Mr. Alden. That's all right, cried Jessie. It is a man. Violet took her grandfather's hand. Are you too worn out to be run just a little way now? Joe is a friend. Joe? Said Mr. Alden. But then he saw two men coming along. My dear John, cried Mr. Alden. Joe ran up and took his uncle's hands. Uncle James, I want you to meet my good friend, Mr. Browning, said Joe. I'm glad to meet you, Mr. Browning, said Mr. Alden, and they shook hands. Then he turned to Joe. But why didn't you come home, John? Why didn't you come right to me? Well, before I came home, I wanted to be sure I was all right, said Joe. But first I went to old Captain Daniel on the island. I met Dr. Moore early this summer when he came with the children. Dr. Moore, do you mean you knew he was here all the time? Asked Mr. Alden. Yes, replied the doctor, but I promised not to tell. I wanted to be sure myself that Joe was well again. Besides, it was a good way for him to get to know his new cousins. I got 2 presents for my birthday, said Benny. A new cousin and a bottle of cream. I feel as if it were my birthday, said Joe, looking at him. So do I, agreed Mr. Alden. I think it's my birthday too, said Mr. Browning, looking at his old friend. It's everybody's birthday, cried Jessie. Can't you all come to the barn for our birthday supper? We can cut the cake into tiny slices. I thought of that also, Jessie, said Mrs. Moore, going over to the little housekeeper. I brought over some sliced ham and other food in those 2 big baskets. I hope you don't mind. I hear you have blackberries and cream. And my birthday cake, said Benny. Oh, dear. I haven't put on the candles yet. I haven't even frosted it, cried Violet. Benny, you stay here with the men, said Jessie. Mrs. Moore will help Henry and me while Violet frosts the cake. Violet put some sugar and egg whites into a bowl. After the frosting was made, she put it on the cake sides and all. Let's put the candles around the edge of the cake and watch in the middle, she said. One day, Henry had bought a little dog that looked just like Watch. The cake looked delicious. Then Violet put it into the little cupboard. Mrs. Moore began to take things out of the baskets. Besides a large plate piled with ham, there were many other delicious things to eat. Jessie was delighted that Mrs. Moore had brought some extra plates and a tablecloth. She helped Mrs. Moore put the white cloth very carefully on the table. Violet set the birthday cake at Benny's place. Then she filled a bowl with purple and white flowers to put in the middle of the table. When Benny saw the cake and the toy dog, he laughed and said, "Oh, that looks just like Watch in the middle of my cake." Now, everybody began to sit down around the table. Some sat on boxes. Grandfather sat on the company chair, and Joe sat on a block of wood. Mrs. Moore passed the plate of ham to Benny. "No, thank you," said Benny. "I don't want any ham. I just want blackberries, sugar, and cream." "Since it's birthday party, let's have what he wants," said Jessie. "I'll feel bad if you don't eat some cake," said Violet. "All right," said Benny. "But after I eat my cake, I don't want anything else except blackberries and cream like Peter Rabbit." "Only Peter Rabbit didn't get any. Don't you remember?" said Grandfather. "He will this time," said Joe. "At last Peter Rabbit has his blackberries and cream on his birthday. Everybody's happy," said Mr. Alden, looking around at all the smiling faces. "And that is just right, because today is everybody's birthday."